It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we are joined by one of our favourite people, and he's here to discuss a hand he played against one of our other favourite people. He is a two-time bracelet winner and a British poker legend. He is Hendon mobster Barny Boatman. Barny, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's great to have you back, Barny. This hand is a blast from the past. It comes from the London EPT in 2006. It's from the TV table, and your opponent is our former guest, Vicky. Coren, good friend of yours, I know. Blinds were 3K, 6K with an old-fashioned 600 ante. So with 8 players at the table, that's 13,800 in dead money. Action folds around to Vicky in the cutoff. She's playing 335k, 56 big blinds. She looks down at King of Diamonds, Jack of Spades, and she makes it 16k. Barny, you have 148k, 25 big blinds, and the Ace of Hearts, 10 of Diamonds. You elect to make the call. The blinds fold. That's all pretty standard stuff. Vicky's range should be reasonably wide linear in this spot, maybe a third of hands. Your range is obviously more condensed and will contain ace X's, some pairs and some broadways. Her open size, though, is a little on the large size, but I thought we could maybe just brush past that.
Sorry, I don't think we can push past that, actually, because it's a funny thing. I mean, this hand, I remember the pre-flop and the river very clearly. The rest is a little bit more hazy, and I'm being reminded of it now by you. Thanks very much. But I remember, and I might have been completely wrong, but this is what I absolutely believed at the time, was that I had a very reliable bet sizing read on Vicky, which was that she bet a little bit less when she wasn't strong. And I don't remember the amounts, but I guess she was betting exactly 3x and then a little bit less with these hands. And I also remember thinking about the sizes of the stacks behind me and thinking, I don't really want to raise here and then be forced into a situation where I have to call when I'm lightly behind. I'd rather just call here. It was very stack size dependent. I remember the commentator at the end of all this thought that went through my head, the commentator just said, Barny likes to see flops.
I have to say, I appreciate you coming in with that, because there I was going to say, well, I don't know if we can read too much into a slightly larger sizing from 2006. And it also, my next question was going to be, was there any dynamics at play that would have led you to garner any information? And you've answered that already. So that's perfect.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that was a fairly common thing back in the day where people would open 3x when they had like ace, king, big pairs, etc. They wanted to charge people, and they used slightly smaller size with the weaker hands. And actually, I mean, on a recent lock-in, I even suggested that this is a perfectly fine strategy if you're at a very weak table where people won't pick up on it. Unfortunately, if you have Barny lurking behind like a hawk, noting all the hands that you're opening to 2.6x and all the hands you're opening to 3x, then it becomes a very bad strategy because your ranges are more face up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to the flop, the pot is 45,800. The flop comes the King of Hearts, 10 of Hearts, 9 of Spades. Vicky checks her top pair and gooder. Barny, you bet 17k, about 37% of pot, and Vicky calls. Dara, when we do these hands from the past, one of the things we're always interested by is how they hold up to solver scrutiny. What does P.O. think of Vicky's check and Barny's bet and his bet size?
Yeah, they both played it perfectly, actually. This might be the first hand we've found more than 10 years old where every street isn't butchered. Vicky very astutely recognises that this is not actually a great flop for her. You talked about the pre-flop ranges there, and this is a flop which Barny has a lot of decent hands on. It's very different from an ace-high flop. King-high flops very often are good for the button calling range. And P.O. recognises in this spot that Barny does actually have a slight range advantage, 53 to 47, which is obviously exacerbated by the fact that he's in position. So therefore, Vicky is actually just supposed to check all of her hands, even if she's flopped a set here or she has a straight, she's just supposed to check. Barny can bet her check, and P.O. mixes the two. It bets 1/3 of the time and it checks 2/3 of the time, and it uses Barny's size. So Barny nailed the sizing as well.
Good job, Barny. Well, Barny, when I think back to my early experiences of live poker, I think of players with the betting lead rarely giving it up to fold. I think one population tendency was to over c-bet, and when a player did check, they usually had a marginal value hand that they wanted to go for a check call. Is that what you expected, but also felt like you could have the best hand and there was no harm in taking the betting lead here?
Yeah, I mean, especially when she just check called me, it didn't feel like any kind of draw. You know, it felt like some kind of made hand, which I could be ahead or behind of. You know, she could have Jack 10.
Well, to the turn, the pot is 79,800, and it comes the 4 of Hearts. So the board now reads King of Hearts, 10 of Hearts, 9 of Spades, 4 of Hearts. The action goes check, check. This is a fascinating street, actually, and probably the crux of the whole hand. Barney, you did a physical thing, I noticed, where you sort of looked up and to your right the way people often do when they're processing something tricky, like they're looking for some negative space that they can put a virtual blackboard on and maybe do a calculation. You've picked up the nut draw here, so there is things to consider. Were you thinking of the merits and demerits of a bet?
Well, first of all, I'd like to ask a question. Can you put a check in the dark into the solver?
You actually can, yeah. You can give the out of position player
that's interesting because that is what happened. I was thinking about that a bit as well, and what that was likely to mean. And I've obviously picked up a lot of equity now. The last thing that I want is to be raised off my hand. If she's got something like King for Jack of Hearts, now she's got the top pair gut shot and the flush draw as far as she's concerned, and she might want to raise all in. If I remember correctly, and I might not be remembering this right, but I think that I was trying to act as if I wanted it to look like I didn't like the heart, because I did. I am guilty of overthinking things quite a lot in this game. But, I kind of felt like I can still rep the nut flush on the end, depending on what happens. I don't have to rep it now. I feel like I'm very lightly beat by a king, but at the same time, I don't think she's that strong. I don't think she's got straights, flushes or sets. I just didn't think she did. That's another thing about the way the game used to be in those days. We used to try and put people on hands more than ranges. I think we were both this way. I think we both knew each other's games quite well and had quite similar games. And she's actually the last person really that I want to be bluffing. I want it to be very convincing because she knows how much I bluff, but she also knows that when I do bluff, I'm usually in her home game smiling and chirping away. And then happily showing the bluff after she folds. She obviously doesn't want that to happen. So I kind of want to look like I'm overdoing the thing that I don't like the heart. That's what was going on in my mind, I think.
I love that description. Dara, Vicky's check is standard, although it was also made in the dark, so I guess it was coming anyway. But I know Barney can go both ways in this spot. Can you elaborate on the theory here?
Yeah, before I do that, I'm actually curious to know whether Barney had to check back to see whether he had a heart or not, or he actually knew that he had the ace of hearts without having to do that.
Oh, no, I knew.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good because that is one of the more egregious tells that a lot of people give off. When the flush gets there and they know they have an unsuited hand, they're not sure what the suits were and they have to check back, which then immediately conveys the information that you don't have the flush already. That's something I always tell my students, memorize the suits in advance so that you don't have to check back and potentially give off that tell. But yeah, Vicky doesn't have any leads here. And actually, you'd really struggle to find any turn cards that she's supposed to lead on. So this is one of those spots where checking in the dark, you could actually do it even in today's game because you're not really giving away any information since you don't have any leads under normal circumstances. Barney's spot is really interesting because thinking like a human, we can make good arguments for betting and checking. If we bet, we can fold out better hands right now. If we get called, we have equity. And if we hit, we win a bigger pot potentially. So you can advance good heuristics for betting. You can also advance good heuristics for checking, as Barney did. Like the last thing we want to do is to be check raised here. So I think in practice, when I'm playing, I would recognize that this is a spot where we can go either way. And it would come down to how likely I think the opponent is to check raise if I bet, in which case I don't want to bet, or how likely it is they'll fold if I bet, in which case, since I only have a fairly weak hand, I will actually bet. Andrew Brokos, in his book Optimum Poker 2, he actually has a whole section at the start of the book which breaks down this exact spot really well, which is when you do pick up the nut flush on the turn, do we bet or do we check? And the solvers mix. And there's a very good reason for that. If you always bet when you pick up the nut flush, then when you've checked and the flush gets there on the river, you can't have the flush anymore. So you can be exploited by a villain who notices this, who goes ahead and overbets. And they can actually overbet for value with, say, the king high flush in that spot because they know that you don't have the ace high flush. On the other hand, if you always check, it's the same thing. Then when you bet and the flush comes in on the river, they know that even if you have a flush, it can't be the nut flush and they can take advantage of that. So because of that, in theory, and the solvers bear this out, you do have to mix. And POS plays exactly 50-50 for this exact reason, that you basically want the nut flush in both ranges when the flush comes in on the river.
That's a great explanation. Well, to the river, the pot is still 79,800 and it comes the 8 of spades. So the board now reads King of Hearts, 10 of Hearts, 9 of Spades, 4 of Hearts, 8 of Spades. Vicky bets 42k, 53% of pot. Before we come to Barney's response, Dara, this is the first and only time either player left the game tree in this hand. Can you tell us what Vicky should have done and why?
Yeah, this is a very odd lead because she's checked 2 streets and now she's led on a card, which shouldn't really improve too many of the hands that she checks twice. I mean, I think I understand her reasons for doing it. She thinks she can potentially get called by worse, and she can potentially get called by worse. A 10 might call. It's also, it might function sometimes as a kind of a blocker bet, in that if Barney has a better hand and he was going to bet a bigger size, maybe he'll just call. So I can see reasons for it, but yeah, this is definitely not solver approved. The solver just goes ahead and checks here and then makes the decision based on Barney's bet size.
Okay, well, in response, Barney, you shove for 115k total. Facing this bet, it does feel like you are mostly beat, but I suppose you could be good occasionally, so calling's not completely out of the question. I really like the creativity and courage to go for the raise here, I must say. The one problem I see is that you don't actually have that many more chips, and while that might make it more convincing in an old school sort of way, we do like to sort of lay bigger prices, I suppose, to our villains when we make raises of this sort, especially when we want folds. When I think of Vicky, I don't think of someone whose game is based around maths so much as it's probably based around logic and how her hand plays and her read of the situation. You are laying her a price of about 3-1 here, 73k to win a pot of 310k. She ultimately tank called. Can you talk us through your decision to raise?
Yes. I mean, you'd be surprised how often it used to work. For exactly the kind of reason that you say, that people, me included, would think through and try and put someone on a hand and work out whether they were winning or losing. As you say, it makes the bluff more convincing. On the other hand, it makes it much more enticing. I felt like she had exactly the hand that she had. And so I couldn't just call. I could fold or go all in. And I like to leave my babies behind. And I just felt like I didn't really have very many bluffs. So in order for her to call, she's got to, which bless her, she did, read it for exactly what it was. I don't know if she put me on the hand in the end, but in the end, it was me and there was a lot of chips there. And she's very brave and a very good player.
Well, I have to say, Barney, you had me convinced that I could see that you didn't have it. But there was something interesting as she broke down the hand. She basically decided that you wouldn't have done this with a set or a straight. And she sort of decided you have a flush or a bluff. And I guess that's where she ended up going in her mind as to how to process the hand. And I thought that was interesting in itself. She sort of spoke her reasoning out loud. Dara, does Pio like Barney's shove as much as I do? And would Pio have called in Vicky's shoes?
Yeah, this is one of those interesting spots. They come up very rarely in the river. Usually by river, decisions are fairly clear-cut. But in this case, Pio will actually do all 3 options at some frequency. It will shove some of the time, it will call some of the time, and it will fold some of the time, which basically means it considers it kind of like a break-even spot. All of those options are equally good. So it will randomize so that it can't be exploited in the bigger picture. In terms of the frequency, the shove is the least frequent option it takes. It only does that 7% of the time. It calls 30% and it folds 63%. Now, that's playing against an opponent who is perfectly balanced. So, in other words, it's assuming that Vicky is bluffing exactly the right amount that she's supposed to be bluffing at that sizing. Against a player who, as Barney seems to have indicated, is more likely to have a sort of a marginal hand and not actually be bluffing, then suddenly the solver will start shoving more because it will recognize that it doesn't have enough showdown to call. So then it'll rule call out as an option, and then it will decide between shoving and folding. It's quite interesting, actually. When I saw this hand, I didn't think too much about Vicky's decision to call based on just the price she's getting. But actually, again, and the same caveat applies. When we're looking at solver output, we're looking at a solver considering what it would do against playing somebody perfectly optimally. In other words, Barney has exactly the right amount of bluffs in this spot that he's supposed to for the relatively small size. And the smaller the size of the bet or the raise, the less bluffing we're supposed to do, period. So Barney shouldn't be bluffing all that often here. The ace of hearts is the obvious bluff card. And a lot of the value is flushes. So what Pio does here is it doesn't worry too much about the value of the actual strength of its hand, that whether it has top pair or any pair. All the pairs are beating the bluffs and not beating the value. So it's more concerned about blocking the value. So it tends to call in these spots when it has a heart, and just fold when it doesn't have a heart. And actually, with Vicky's exact hand, it does fold. Now, one of the things you can do in the solver is look at how much the call loses. And the call doesn't lose very much here. It loses just over 2 big blinds. So again, this is one of those spots where the villain tendencies are much more important than GTO, let's say, because people will either be over bluffing or under bluffing in this spot, and usually by a much larger margin than 2 big blinds in equity. So if Vicky is convinced that Barney is over bluffing, and he doesn't need to be bluffing very much at all to be over bluffing at this size, then it becomes a call.
From Vicky's point of view, Dara, how much is Barney going to have to be over bluffing here in order to scrape back those few big blinds?
Not very much at all when you consider the size of the pot. And, you know, all those times Barney chirped away at her in her home game and then smiled and showed the bluff when she folded, they probably came back to haunt him in this case.
I mean, you've got to say, I don't know if she'd ever been in that spot before, but certainly wouldn't have been often at that stage in her career where she was playing for a huge prize and her composure was very, very good. She did what she had to do. You could tell she didn't like it, but she knew she had to do it. And I remember saying in my exit interview that I thought she was going to win it and that people didn't realise how good she was. And I think in my defence, I don't think I would have made the bluff if I didn't credit her with the ability to figure out that I shouldn't be bluffing. But at the same time, she also figured out that she had the price to call.
Well, a fascinating hand that I just knew would hold up pretty well under the microscope as soon as I saw it. Barney, I assume it doesn't surprise you one bit that you were solver approved.
When you said yesterday that you want to do this hand, you sent me a link, I had a quick look. And I looked at the size of the shove and I kind of thought, well, you know, they're probably going to say you're getting called all the time with top pair here. But the thing is, I'm a thinking player. Whether I think the right thing or not, it doesn't matter. That's why I kind of laughed at that comment from the commentator about, oh, Barney likes to see flops. It reminded me of something a bit more recently when I was in the last big final I've been in, which was in Vegas in the Millionaire Maker. And there was the hand where there's been a raise, a min click and a call. I'm on the big blind and I'm deep and I've got Jack 9. And I flopped. I'm up and down, but there's a pair on the board and a 4 flush. And I'm facing a bet. And I thought about the fact that there's also a flush draw and a pair on there and I might make my hand and lose. But I thought a lot about the ICM implications of that there were about 3 people with quite a lot less chips than me, one very low, and it would be a disaster. I also thought about the fact that I wasn't blocking any of the cards that make somebody else's hand. And in the end, I just decided, after quite a lot of thought, that I should just throw the hand away. And the commentator said, oh, well, Barney's a field player. And I thought...
Barney went for his read, got his read.
Yeah, I had no read at all. It was maths. You know, I'm not saying I get the sums right, but I do try and do them.
I love that. That's absolutely brilliant. Well, look, I appreciate getting your thoughts on a really cool hand from the past. I think both you and Vicky played it superbly for what it's worth. Barny Boatman, thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Barney.